Adolf Hitler is, without a doubt, one of the most destructive figures in all of human history, a man responsible for a world war and atrocities that are still hard to comprehend. But how did it happen? In this explainer, we're going to trace his path from a failed artist to an absolute dictator to really understand the moments that defined his rise and his catastrophic legacy.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start at the very beginning, his early years. Then we'll look at how the First World War forged his worldview. From there, we'll track his rise to power, see how he built his dictatorship, and then cover the inevitable results, war and genocide. And finally, we'll grapple with the devastating legacy he left behind.
So let's start in Austria, because honestly, if you look at his early life, there are very few signs that would point to the monstrous path he would eventually take.
He actually started out as an aspiring artist, but after getting rejected, not once but twice, from Vienna's prestigious Academy of Fine Arts, his life really started to drift. He ended up living in poverty, and it was during these years in Vienna that he began soaking up the extremist ideologies that were swirling around, a toxic mix of fervent German nationalism and virulent anti-Semitism. This period of personal failure, well, it became the breeding ground for his entire worldview.
Next up, we'll see how the brutal, transformative experience of World War I took this struggling artist and hardened his ideologies into something much, much more dangerous.
So when war broke out in 1914, he jumped at the chance, volunteering for the German army. He served on the Western Front, was wounded a couple of times, and was even decorated for bravery. But the crucial part is how it all ended for him. Not in victory, but in this deep, personal sense of betrayal and humiliation after Germany lost and was hit with the harsh Treaty of Versailles. That bitterness, it became the fuel for everything that came next.
So here's the big question, right? How does a disgruntled, unknown corporal go from total obscurity to controlling an entire nation? Well, the decade after the war was anything but random. It was a methodical, calculated climb to the top.
His path to power was strategic. After joining a tiny extremist party, he tried to seize power in a violent coup, the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed, and he landed in prison. But he used that failure. He wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf, and decided to take power through politics, not force. This climb eventually led to him being appointed chancellor in 1933, and less than a year later, he'd merged all the power into one role, the Führer, the absolute leader.
You know, in prison, he didn't just serve time. He literally wrote the blueprint for his entire future. Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, laid out his destructive vision for everyone to see. In retrospect, it was a warning of exactly what was to come, a warning that was largely ignored at the time.
And inside that book were the 4 pillars of his ideology. These weren't just abstract ideas. They became the literal policies of the Nazi regime. The belief in a superior Aryan race, a deep-seated hatred of Jewish people, a fierce opposition to communism, and this relentless demand for living space in the East, this was the justification for both World War II and the Holocaust.
So, once he had power, Hitler moved with terrifying speed to completely dismantle German democracy. He wanted to build a totalitarian state, and he called it the Third Reich.
He systematically got rid of any and all checks on his power. All other political parties? Banned. The media? Completely controlled by the state. He created the Gestapo, a secret police force, to terrorize the population into submission. And all the while, he was openly rearming Germany, getting ready for the war he had always planned to start.
This was a really critical and chilling turning point. In 1935, his anti-Semitic ideology was officially written into the law of the land. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship and their most basic rights, turning persecution into state-sponsored policy.
And then, in 1938, all that hateful rhetoric exploded into organized nationwide violence. On Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Nazi stormtroopers and regular civilians went on a rampage, destroying Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues. It was a brutal, terrifying preview of the horrors that were just around the corner.
Hitler's ambitions were never ever just about Germany. His core ideology, especially that demand for Lebensraum, or living space, required conquest. It demanded war.
The war kicked off with the invasion of Poland in 1939, and his initial conquests were shockingly fast, with much of Western Europe falling under his control. But then came the fateful, disastrous decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. That opened up a brutal Eastern Front that ultimately bled the German war machine dry, leading to a slow, grinding defeat as the Allies closed in from both sides.
And running parallel to the war was the regime's most horrific objective, the Holocaust. And this is so important to understand. It was not a byproduct of the war. It was a central goal. It was the systematic, industrialized mass murder of Europe's Jewish population and millions of others the Nazis deemed undesirable.
The scale of it is it's almost impossible to comprehend. 6 million. That is the number of Jewish men, women, and children who were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. It's a number we must never, ever forget.
And the Nazi campaign of mass murder was even broader than that. They targeted millions more: Poles, Slavs, Roma people, individuals with disabilities, and anyone who dared to politically oppose the regime. They were all persecuted, imprisoned, and killed in staggering numbers.
So finally, we have to look at the world Hitler left behind. As Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin in April 1945, he committed suicide in his bunker, leaving behind a continent in absolute ruins and a legacy of pure, unparalleled evil.
The contrast between what he promised and the reality he delivered is just staggering. He promised a glorious Aryan empire that would last 1,000 years. He left behind a Germany defeated and in ruins. He sought living space in the East. He found his own end in a concrete bunker. And instead of eternal glory, his name became forever synonymous with evil itself. His legacy is unambiguous. There's no debate. He is remembered as the man who started the deadliest war in human history and orchestrated one of the most horrific genocides the world has ever seen. He stands as a stark, eternal warning against the dangers of unchecked power, fascism, and extreme nationalism.
And that leaves us with this final, crucial question. This isn't just about looking back at one man. It's about understanding the conditions that allowed such a man to rise in the first place. Because examining this history isn't just an academic exercise, it's absolutely essential if we want to protect our present and our future.